My name is Madeline Godwin, and today I'm going to be presenting my learning theory on the social cognitive learning theory, and more specifically, Albert Bandura. So, a little bit about Albert Bandura and his early work. Albert Bandura was born in a small town with about only 400 people and 2 teachers in his whole entire high school. This brought many limitations to the field of education for Bandura, but it also helped motivate him and widen his perspectives as he began to expand his social cognitive learning theory. Bandura was able to push himself more to gain his own knowledge because there weren't so many people pushing him in his own town. He was the youngest of his siblings, which brought him to the thought that he needed to be the best and he wanted to explore education more himself. In 1974, he was elected president of the APA, which was the American Psychological Association. His initial research was on social learning and aggression. This research was done with another man, and it led to the formation of 2 widely known books, especially the first one written about aggression. His work eventually led to the famous Bobo doll experiment, which is also a widely known experiment about aggression. So I want to take a minute and explain exactly what the Bobo doll experiment was and how Bandura used it not only to exemplify aggression at the time, but he also used it later on in his work in his social cognitive learning theory to show how observation, not only from children, but from people of all ages, had such an impact on learning. So the Bobo doll experiment was pretty much the interaction between a child and an adult or an authority figure. The experiment started off with the adult or the authority figure having a baby doll or some sort of representation of a baby doll, and the adult was abusing, treating the baby doll wrong, hitting it, just being disrespectful to it. So as you can imagine, when the child was given the same baby doll or another baby doll in general, the child had that mentality that that's how the baby doll was supposed to be treated, and that's what the child did. That's what the child had observed from the adult, so that's how the child treated the baby. And this was a great study for Albert Bandura's study on aggression, but later on in life, Albert Bandura expanded this to use it in his observational studies for the social cognitive learning theory. So to move on, in 1986, the name of Bandura's theory was changed to the social cognitive learning theory and not just the social learning theory. Albert Bandura used some perspectives from the cognitive theory that he incorporated into his work, so he changed the name to the social cognitive learning theory. Bandura's theory is used in general in education to help train teachers and motivate students in setting and accomplishing goals. So a few basic ideas of Bandura's theory that it started off with that I just want to go over is that there were 3 main actions Bandura stated needed to happen for his social cognitive learning theory. The first one being observation, the second imitation, and then the third one modeling. For these steps to happen, they have to go in order: observation first, then imitation, and then modeling. So observation, according to Bandura, was the act of watching, listening to, reading about, hearing, any form of seeing or observing, in general, absorbing someone else do a desired thing. As long as you're observing that desired thing happening in some form or fashion, then observation was taking place. You could be reading about something, about someone doing something, and then you are observing it. You are learning. In general, that was the key essence, was the observation point, according to Bandura, before you could do the next steps. So after you had the observation step, imitation was the next step. And that came from trying to do it yourself in the way that you had observed. Imitation was you trying to do those exact steps that you had seen or that you had heard or that you had watched happen or that you had read about. You tried to imitate it. And that was a form of modeling the behavior. Eventually, you did that imitation and you modeled it exactly how you had done it. And that was Albert Bandura's basic 3 steps to his social cognitive learning theory. So to expand on this, Albert Bandura stated that for learning to happen, a permanent change in behavior also had to happen. Learning was not just memorizing something long enough to write the answer down on a test or a quiz and then move on in class. A permanent change in behavior or in knowledge had to happen, according to Bandura, for learning to take place. So for this to happen, Bandura's theory expanded a little bit and got a little bit more complex, and it also added in 4 more necessary steps, which were attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So I just want to take a minute and go over the key definitions for these words and explain exactly how they fit into and what they meant to Bandura's theory. So attention was first. In general, attention means to just pay attention to something, what you were learning in Bandura's theory. You have to not necessarily sit down, but just watch it, listen to it, just observe, in essence, of what is happening or what you're trying to observe. You have to pay attention. So from that point, these also go in order. You have to retain the information, which was the retention stage. You pay attention and you retain the information at the same time. But if you're just paying attention, not retaining any of the information, you can't move on to the next 2 steps. So retention was a key factor in learning, according to Bandura. You had to retain the information, you had to absorb it, and for it to actually go into your brain, you had to acknowledge it. So that was the retention stage. Then reproduction could take place. Reproduction was you trying to do the action that you had learned yourself. You're reproducing it in your best way. You're trying to imitate it according to how you knew how to do it, according to what you had learned, in essence. So for this to happen, the 4th stage took place pretty much at the same time. You had to have motivation. Not just the motivation to keep going even when you fail, which yes, that was a big part of motivation, but you had to have the motivation to do that action in the first place. So a good example of this is you're not just going to raise your hand in class. You're only going to raise your hand if you have a question or if you know the answer to a question. That is the motivation to raise your hand. You're not going to do the action without having motivation to do it. So according to Bandura, these were the 4 steps that were necessary for learning, and they could not successfully take place without these 4 steps. So now I just want to take a minute and show you 2 great examples, 2 of the purest examples that I think I could find about the social cognitive learning theory actually in action in a classroom. So the first one here is a teacher sitting down with a student, one-on-one interaction here, showing the student how to cut a piece of paper. So first, if we just go over the steps again, the student has to pay attention. The student is sitting here one-on-one right in front of the teacher, paying attention. I hope she is retaining the information. She needs to absorb that the paper goes in between the top piece and the bottom piece of the scissors, and that is how you cut the paper. The next step for her would be to reproduce the action, but there would be motivation that needed to happen for that. There would need to be an assignment or a project, and of course it looks like there is. They're not just randomly cutting paper. It looks like there's an assignment that they're doing that paper is needed to be cut for. So the teacher is teaching her. She needs to be motivated to cut that paper. So now she can reproduce the action and cut the paper herself once she has obtained that information. The next example I think is a really good example of how sociology, the social cognitive learning theory, takes place in the classroom, because observation can be done not just one-on-one with the teacher, but observation was also done in the classroom among other students. So of course the teacher is going to tell you to raise your hand if you know the answer to a question. You're not always going to do that, but a key factor is observing other students doing that same action. Students learn not to shout out answers, but rather raise their hand through this social cognitive learning theory that Bandura created. When you see other students raising their hands around you, and you see that after they get called on, they tell the correct answer to a question, then the next time that you are motivated and you have the correct answer to a question, you will also raise your hand in class and try to get called on. That is how you learn, and you also try to observe, retain that information, and then reproduce it and do it yourself the next time, so that you can raise your hand and get called on. So just to dig a little bit deeper into Bandura's social cognitive learning theory, there was so many things that Bandura covered, and it covered almost every aspect of teaching and learning. The main limitation, of course, with every learning theory, there's a few limitations, but the main limitation that Bandura did not cover was that it is on the student themselves to retain the information and reproduce it. Other learning theories go back and assess students and cover that it's not fully on the student, that the student learns and you go back and assess it and work with the student over and over again and return to previous things that the student had learned. Bandura doesn't specifically state that. Bandura specifically states the fact of observation over and over again. Observation can be direct instruction in the classroom, a project, and reading information. Observation could even be watching a video in class and obtaining the information visually and auditorily. But Bandura just stresses that as long as the student is observing the information in some fashion or form, then it is on the student to actually retain the information and be able to have the capacity to reproduce it themselves with practice and work and over and over again trying to do it and observing the information. So eventually the student will learn and we'll get to that point, but that is the only main limitation through Bandura's social cognitive learning theory. I lastly just want to show you my 3 references. Of course, I used the textbook for my main source, but I wanted to dig deeper into these 3 sources, and they are some great sources. I hope that you learned very much from my presentation on the social cognitive learning theory and Bandura. Thank you so much.